licensure. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, is there anyone here? There's no one signed up to speak on this bill. Is there anyone in the audience to speak against the bill, for the bill? Seeing none, you ready to close for your bill?
I think I am closed. I just want to make a note that there's no known opposition, and I would appreciate a good vote.
What's the will of the committee?
Motion to pass.
Representative Payton made a motion to do pass. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. I appreciate it.
That was a do pass as amended.
Let the record show, do pass as amended. Thank you, Representative Payton. Representative Marker, do you want to explain what it is?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just to add my seatmate, Representative Cloud, as a co-sponsor.
A motion, Representative Dotson, to adopt the amendment. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Your amendment's been adopted. You're recognized to present your bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. House Bill 1402 is a bill to improve the existing Abortion-Inducing Drugs Safety Act of 2015. The bill seeks to improve the safety protocols for women to whom these abortion-inducing drugs are given. Does that in several ways, and I'll address those ways briefly, and then let Ken introduce himself, see if I've missed anything. The first thing the bill does, obviously, is replaces and updates language to the existing act. The bill requires the abortion-inducing drugs to be dispensed according to FDA protocols. One of those, and as listed in the bill, important protocols, is that it cannot be delivered by mail, courier, or delivery service. The bill requires informed consent to ensure that the woman choosing to have these drugs receives comprehensive and intrauterine pregnancy. The bill requires this from this type of abortion, or to have a signed agreement with an associate physician who is also credentialed to handle abortion complications. And then finally, the bill states that certain information in this process must be included in the woman's medical records. And that's the gist of the bill.
Did you have someone to help you present?
Yes, if you would let him introduce himself, please.
Please introduce yourself and who you represent.
Thank you.
I'm Ken Yang. I'm the Director of Governmental Affairs with Arkansas Family Council.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thank y'all for having me. This is one of the great pieces of legislation that was passed in 2015. But science has changed, FDA protocols has changed, administrations have changed, and so this will keep us up to date with ever change. Also, FDA protocols have loosened with a court case in 2016, and there's a where the actual protocols may disappear with the new Biden administration. So we just don't want our laws tied to something that's might be disappearing. Another thing I think this addresses is the adverse effects when taking abortion-inducing drugs. And so we had a great legislature in 2015 that had the foresight to pass something like this, because in other states, there's actually a recent Times article that talked about abortion clinics, Planned Parenthood using the RU-486 now as a missed period pill. So, and the Planned Parenthood would acquiesce and say, well, here's the missed period pill, instead of actually dispensing it as an abortion-inducing drug. So we thankfully already had this to address that, and this just makes it stronger, make sure that that also does not happen here in the state of Arkansas. And so with that, like I said, changing protocols and a new administration, this will address our law and make it stronger, and be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from committee? Representative Ferguson, you're recognized.
Go back to what you said about it can't be delivered by a mail delivery man.
Right. directly to the woman.
It can be delivered to the clinic.
Yes, but not directly to the patient.
Oh, I thought you meant it couldn't even be delivered to.
No, I'm sorry. I
Okay.
should have made that clear.
Thank you.
Representative Cloud, you recognized for a question.
Motion is qualified.
Any other questions from committee? Okay, we do have one person signed up to speak against the bill. Karen Music, if you would go to the table and introduce yourself.
My name is Karen Music, and I'm co-founder of Arkansas Abortion Support Network. Another day, another abortion restriction here in Arkansas. I've been asked to speak by hundreds of Arkansans, actually thousands of Arkansans. Enough with these abortion restrictions already. The changes proposed in this current law would do nothing and serve zero medical purpose and is meant only to make abortion more complex and inconvenient to provide. It has nothing to do with the safety of Arkansans. It's a lie to even imply it's protecting women. Legal abortion is safer than a colonoscopy, safer than having your wisdom teeth removed, and many, many times safer than delivering a child. The risk of dying from childbirth is 14 times higher than the risk of dying from an abortion. And in many parts of this state, that risk is even double that or more. Arkansas women want and need medical, reproductive care like everyone else in the United States of America. Half of the workforce here in Arkansas has a uterus, and a quarter of those will need access to abortion care at some point in their life. We already know your families and your friends are utilizing abortion care. This only will make it harder for the poorest people in the state. And it feels to me like a Christian terrorism. It's clear you have not been listening to the women who have told you over and over again that they do not regret their abortion. Their lives are better because of an abortion. And to presume the majority of Arkansans think a 10-year-old child should be forced into birth is just outrageous. That still is hard for me. I pray the voters of this state will hold you to account for this hateful 2021 Arkansas Republican legislative agenda. Do you want businesses here or not? You get to have a say in that. And in this proposed law, it says half of the workforce bodies belong to the state of Arkansas. That's not true. You can't have them. Please vote no on this punitive bill, HB 1402.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone here in the audience to speak for the bill? Against the bill? Seeing none, are you ready to close for your bill, Representative?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to reiterate that this is a safety bill. As with other procedures, I think it's hard to argue that there's safety in being fully informed, in being fully examined, and in being fully prepared in case things do not go the way you want them to. Thank you.
What's the will of the committee? Representative Cloud, I'm sorry. You're recognized for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Motion do pass.
Have a motion of do pass as amended by Representative Cloud. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee.
Okay, we're going to move on down to SB 301. Who was going to present that bill? Lost my sheet here. There we go. Gonzalez, Representative Gonzalez, are you ready to present SB 301?
Senator Sullivan was going to come down and settle down that thing. You mind passing over for now?
Okay. All right. We're going to move down to SB 289. Representative Smith, Senator Hammer, was he going to be here?
I thought he was,
We can move on down and come back to you when he.
well, you know what, we really don't need him to be here.
You report to the table and I'll tell him you said that.
He knows, I've been texting, so,
So Representative Smith, you are recognized to present SB 289.
We're probably going to be recognized for a lot more after that comment. Mr. Chair, I'd like to have Stephanie Nichols come and sit at the end of the table, and also Luke McCoy, if he's in the room, just to potentially ask questions if we're asked, if that's all right.
If you would, please introduce yourself and who you represent.
I'm Stephanie Nichols. I'm from Jonesboro, Arkansas, and I work for Alliance Defending Freedom as legal counsel.
Thank you. Representative Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee, I want to thank you all for the input that you made on this bill. There were so many comments and some help that you provided in helping make this bill better. As a matter of fact, these amendments have been engrossed in the bill. There are 3 pages of amendments, and we believe we've answered every concern, every issue. And so what you have in front of you on your screen or tablet is a much better bill than what we presented just a short several days ago. And so I don't think there's a need to go into a lot of reading and discussion on this from my part, but I would just ask that you look through the bill. You probably have already done that, and you will see that these amendments have been engrossed and they're ready to be presented back to you for a good vote.
Representative Eubanks, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Smith, I was asked by K-12 Education to ask if there was anything in this bill that might affect their operations with regard to their school nurses. I think I know the answer to that, but I told them I'd ask the question and see if there was any way that this would interfere with anything that they do.
Thank you for the question, Representative Eubanks. And there is nothing in this bill that would impact K through 12 nurses, school nurses in any way. And I'd like to defer to make sure that my statement is accurate to Mrs. Nichols.
I will say that it could theoretically, have a small impact on a K through 12. You would have to have something like, let me give you an example that I've heard from one superintendent. Let's say that a medication was being given to a student every day for gender transition for a minor. Now, your committee's voted to ban that, and so has the House, so that's, possibly a moot point anyway. But if a nurse had a conscience objection to that, then there may need to be worked out some ability for her to step away temporarily, or for the parent to administer that drug so that day after day the nurse didn't have to be complicit in something that violated her conscience. But other things that schools offer, like therapy services, there are absolutely no conscience cases in the United States based on somebody not wanting to perform speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, those sort of things. And Illinois and Mississippi that have broad conscience laws, there's only a handful of cases that have come about in those states, and none of them involve public schools. So I'm very confident that this does not pose a threat to public schools, and it also has institutional liability protections. Like if the public school nurse did have a conscience objection on a rare occasion, the public schools could not be held liable for that. We think that's very important.
Representative Allen, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2A, would you please help me better understand that?
I'm sorry, was that a question for me or for representatives?
Either one of you.
Are you talking about conscience means the religious? Is that the line that you're referring?
2A is, discriminate means to take a certain action.
Line 28, line 28
28, okay.
on page 2.
Go ahead.
I'm prepared to address that. So adverse action, that's very important language because that doesn't mean that any accommodations you work out with your employees are necessarily adverse action. You'd have to be putting the employee with a conscience objection in a worse position for it to be adverse action. You're still free to work things out with that employee.
Did that answer your question, Representative Allen?
Okay.
Expound a little bit.
Okay, so for example, things in case law, in conscience law, is that you can work out an accommodation or transfer of an employee to other job duties, but it does not need to be a worse position. So for example, let's say you have a nurse working the daytime shift. If at all possible, you don't need to transfer the nurse to the nighttime shift like a punishment. Adverse action is something that's kind of a punishment. So the simplest way to understand this is that you can't punish your employee for exercising conscience. Now you'll see that some of the amendments that have been added to protect employers so that they can dive into what potential conscience objections an employee might have before they're hired. Then that employee is protected if they've disclosed their conscience objections, and you later on try to, let's say for example, a nurse is hired and she's working for an OBGYN clinic and that clinic does not perform abortions. Then later on they decide to. That's an example of where that nurse should be covered under this law. But if a nurse goes to work for Planned Parenthood, she knows full well what she's getting herself into. It's a different situation.
All right, any other questions from committee? Representative Payton, you're recognized.
Thank you. Could you spend a few minutes and expound on the definition of conscience here?
Yes. Okay, so the definition of conscience has been narrowed and tightened up, and honestly, it was a good suggestion. The philosophical part of the definition has been deleted, and it's left with religious, moral, and ethical. And we have more case law in the United States that shows what that means. And it's a more secure footing for conscience. And honestly, I actually feel good about that change. It's a tightening up with some good suggestions from legislators. And I have to say that I think the political process and this amendment process and listening to different voices worked as it should to tighten up the bill and make it still a good bill, but something that medical institutions and others could be more confident about.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Seeing none, we do have 2 people signed up to speak against the bill. Karen Musick, you would come to the table. Please introduce yourself and who you represent.
Again, my name is Karen Musick.
Could you pull your mic a little closer to hear you better? Thank you.
Is this better? My name is Karen Musick. It's easier than it looks. I represent Arkansas Abortion Support Network. We started doing clinic escorting at abortion clinics years ago. I'm going to tell you a short story about a woman who came into the clinic. As she walked in, she said, "I'm 45 years old. I'm too old to be going through this again. I just got my last one off to college." I think that's a feeling most of us can identify with, or many of us can. When she came out, she had a long face and said, "I was not prepared for that." And of course I talked to her and she said, "There's no heartbeat. No heartbeat, nothing they can do. They sent me to my ODBYN." She had insurance. She was able to go to her medical doctor. Imagine my surprise 2 days later when she showed back up, because her medical doctor, her OBGYN, refused to treat her because she told him she had considered an abortion. Where do you draw the line on the consciousness of providers as opposed to the consciousness of patients? Where do the patients lie in this? I would say this woman's life has value, and it needs to be recognized as such. She ended up paying for an abortion she didn't need, that her insurance would have paid for, if her doctor had followed what her doctor does for every other patient that has not thought of having an abortion.
Thank you for your comments. Mike Hernandez, if you would come to the table to speak against the bill. Please introduce yourself and who you represent.
Dr. Mike Hernandez from the Administrators Association. So I'll be honest, definitely not my bailiwick to come in here to the health department and talk about education type stuff. And so one of the reasons that brought me here is just some concerns. We have been in conversation with the sponsor as well as the attorney here about the possibility of amending K-12 out of this. We have several concerns that as it relates to counselors, nurses, any social workers working for the district. In a number of districts, which some of you may have those in your school districts that include a school-based health center. We're not real sure how this impacts. Based on our review, there's things where, kids come in and they have various issues from medical to mental to all kinds of things that they may want us to discuss or be counseled on. The people that are working for the districts are employed by the districts and contracted. And so we are very concerned about what impact this would have as it relates to those things, and may make districts, not be able to deal with their employees directly, because there isn't a lot of choice when it comes to coming to public schools. And a little bit about the timing of this. When this bill would actually, if it were to pass, we would understand it go into effect kind of in the middle of the school contract year. Again, meshing school districts and timing with this. And so there wouldn't be a timing where, the district would already be in contract and be working with that employee. So there wouldn't be that opportunity to conscientiously object to the things that are in roles of their contract. In addition to that, being able to do anything about that if a person chooses not to perform work based on a conscious decision. We appreciate the definition that was given, but those are just our concerns with this bill.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak for the bill? Against the bill? Seeing none, are you ready to close for your bill, Representative?
I'm ready to close for the bill with the following statement. When this bill was presented in Senate Public Health, one of the comments that Senator Hammer made in his closing remarks, and I'll share that with you right now, is when we talk about the rights of conscience, fundamental decision-making that we all value in our personal lives, if there's not a remedy, if there's no solution, there's no remedy. And this bill provides a solution and a remedy to protecting the rights of medical workers. And so with that, I would ask for a good vote.
What's the will of the committee? Representative Boyd, have a due pass by Representative Boyd. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
Thank you, committee.
Okay, next on the agenda is HCR 1003, Representative Gonzalez. Okay. Okay, moving down to SB 378, that's Senator Hammer and Representative Gassaway. Representative Gassaway here. All right. We're moving down the agenda pretty good today. All right, we're going to go to the consent agenda. And Representative Hawks asked if he could move his to the next meeting. So the next item on the agenda is HB 1016. Representative Rye, you're recognized to present your bill.
Thank you, committee. The reason that I'm here with you today is, I love children, and, we've got a problem. I'm not saying we're gonna fix it overnight. I'm not trying to. Just want to do the things that we can do, to protect, children within swimming pool areas. This is the issue is very close to my heart, and I would say I love children, and this is about pool safety. I didn't know this till I started working on the bill, but as of June the 16th, 2020, drowning is the second leading cause of unintentional injury and death of children in the state of Arkansas. Data shows 98% cannot swim, and 50% of the kids over the age of 15 also can't swim. Thousands more suffer moderate to severe injuries as a result of submission, not excluding elderly persons. Those that are disabled, rather than it be mentally, whether it be mentally or physically, as well as handicapped persons. I'd like to tell you about a child. This was the last one, as far as I know, in Poinsett County. The child's name was Alex, little boy, little Spanish boy, over in Mark Tree, but I didn't know it till these folks come to me, asked me about it. But actually, this is the third one that occurred, and it's a pretty bad thing. And what I would like to do is, step one, it's not going to cost very little to nothing. I mean, it's not going to cost a lot, okay? We got children that are dying, and they're drowning, and a lot of times they don't have supervision. I didn't know a lot about that. But this little boy's name's Alex. He stumbled over to his neighbor's yard. His little brother was right there with him, 4 years old. And he watched his brother die. Charles Thompson's here with me. He's from the Department of Health. They're going to help us with it. Not going to cost a whole lot. And what we're going to try to do, basically, all of the people that produce swimming pools and sell from outside the border and inside the border to anyone, all we're going to do is prepare a manual. And in this manual, it will tell you about the dangers of not having a fenced area and a lock. I'm not going to make anyone do anything. It's basically, we're telling people that there is an outlet and there is a danger. And I'd appreciate a good vote on this. If there's something about this bill that someone's having a problem with, all you got to do is let me know. I'm open-minded to changing anything that will cut down on this problem. And I appreciate you.
All right, committee, any questions? Representative Allen, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Rye, how would you enforce something like this?
You can't enforce it, Fred. There's no law right now.
So this is just
right. There's no law. Fred, it's not going to be an enforcement. This is mainly going to start out, and as far as I know, it'll never get any farther than education. We want to educate the people that are buying swimming pools of the need to be fenced in, because, Fred, it's easy for a child to walk into another yard and drown and no one even know it. But as far as enforcement,
You don't have any enforcement. You can't even, across the state, Fred, there's not even a permit system in the counties. So you don't have to worry about counties enforcing a code, you know, and cities do, but I didn't want to do it that way. I thought the best thing to do is take it to the committee, let them know the problem that's out here, let you know, and let's do something. I mean, let's do something to inform the public of situations, because second cause of death in the state of Arkansas is drowning for children.
Yeah, Representative Wright, yeah, I had a comment, really not a question, but I thought, and I believe in Jonesboro, they have this law where you do have to have a fence. Are there my question is, are there certain cities in the state that have a law?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, there is, Representative Jack, and they can do that on their own. But actually, Representative Jack, this is not what we're trying to do here. I mean, it'd be nice if everybody could have a fence around a swimming pool. There's people that don't. And you know, that's okay. I mean, it's not against the law. But what we're trying to do, Representative Jack, is let people know. Because if you do have a chance and you build a house and you want to put in a swimming pool, it sure would be a great idea if you could put a fence up around it.
Any other questions from committee? Representative Payton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Wright, at the bottom of page 2, paragraph C starts with any person entering into an agreement to install, construct, repair, or remodel a residential swimming pool shall give this notice. So, I mean, there is enforcement. I mean, what happens if they don't do that? Because it says shall.
There is no penalty. There is no penalty, John, Representative John.
You don't think there'll be a penalty coming?
No, sir, there's no penalty at all, Representative John. This is just to let people know about the problems. And we got, Charles is working on this for us. It's not gonna cost a whole lot. But the main thing is anyone that would, like you say, if they did remodel, and I don't know if that would even be called, John, within that situation, but the main thing is just people putting in pools, John, to let people know the dangers.
I got to follow up. It says
Yes.
repaired.
Well, but John, how would you keep up with that? There's no way to keep it
That's
up.
kind of my point. I don't know how you would. You put it.
You wouldn't, John, because there's no law on it.
Okay.
I'm not trying to do a real law as far as the law is concerned. The law I'm trying to make out with this, guys and girls, is just something to let our people know that we have a problem, and if they buy a swimming pool, then they will, they'll get a package to show of the dangers of pool safety.
Representative Allen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing this bill, but you keep saying it's not going to cost very much. You keep saying it's not going to cost very much.
It's not.
So what cost would be associated with this bill?
The cost of printing the material.
So who's going to print it?
Right here.
The
Department of Health.
Okay.
If you would come forward to the table and introduce yourself, if you can answer Representative Allen's question.
Charles Thompson, Attorney, Arkansas Department of Health. I appreciate it, Chair. Representative Allen, Representative Rye came to us with his concerns about this. The bill was a lot different when was originally presented to us. We found a way to get it to a point where it got to the intent of what he wanted with a very, very minimal cost. So the idea was that we would do some educational materials on pool safety, put it on our website, and anybody could just go and click and print that off. So we realized that was that'd be a de minimis cost to the department. We got to Representative Bride where he needed to be with his intent, and so we, as a department, don't have a problem with the bill.
Is it possible we could do some PSAs on the public service announcements or something?
Representative, we haven't gotten that far, but I think as part of Representative Rye felt strongly that maybe if we could get a group together to discuss these issues, that the department said we'd be willing for discussion with stakeholders and industry professionals when it comes to pools. And I think that could be something as part of that discussion. But I think that was Representative Rye's intent, is to get the ball rolling, kind of have these discussions, is how we understood it to be.
Okay. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Rye, for your time.
Representative Dawson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm trying to figure out why we need a bill for this. Can the Department of Health not already provide education or put something on your website or get people together? I mean, the danger seems to be obvious. Wouldn't the resolution kind of cover this maybe?
Representative Dodson, yes, the answer is yes. Again, this is not the Department of Health bill. This is Representative Ryan. He's very passionate about it. We understand his passion. We're about pool safety as well. I mean, public health and safety. So, but I think he saw a concern. It touches close to home, and he felt that it's something that we needed to I'm speaking for him, but that's what he expressed to us, that it was something that needed to be taken seriously. But to your point, the Department of Health is all about education, and we can do things with education alone.
So you can do everything within this bill without the bill actually being law?
From a Department of Health standpoint, as to the educational portion, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Payton, did you just have a question or did you have something else?
No, I just have a question.
Okay. Representative Perry, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the reasoning behind, actually, we have a swimming pool. We have a privacy fence and a separate fence around the pool. So just to prevent those kind of illness, kind of concerns. But in your work group, you may want to add someone from the insurance industry as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Miller, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is for both of you gentlemen. Representative Johnny, would you be happy with the department just posting like pool safety tips and stuff for consumers on their website or whatever? And I mean, the department seems willing to do that as of now. Am I correct? I just understood.
Representative Miller, we're willing to do whatever this body says, or what Representative Ryan to get his intent, whatever this body says, we're able to do when it comes to the swimming pool safety educational component.
Whatever it takes, we'll do it. Do we need to amend the bill to make it right for you?
No, I'm just thinking maybe we don't need to put it in law if they're willing to do it. I think you're doing a good thing. They seem willing to do it. It can just save us another law.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gray, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the work group that's being established on the last page 3, it talks about to study the feasibility of adopting an international swimming pool and spa code of the International Code Council. So my question would be, I guess, to the Department of Health is, what swimming pool standards are we using currently?
Representative Gray, currently we do monitor public swimming pools, and those are rules and regs. Rules, we use the term rules now, I'm sorry. No longer use regulation. Rules that come through ALC and this body approves. So that is it's based on science and standards, usual industry standards, but it's also approved by the Arkansas General Assembly through ALC.
Okay, follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yes, you're recognized.
Thank you. I don't know anything about these international standards, but would it be would this be a very large increase in regulations if we were to do this? Do you know?
Representative Gray, I do know that the international code when it comes to spa and pools is lengthy. I can state that. The Department of Health has not taken a position on the adoption of such a code. That would be something to discuss, but we've not taken a position on that, but it is a lengthy code book to my understanding.
Thank you.
Representative Payton, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is probably to either or both of you. Do we have any data or studies that show the percentage of pool owners that maybe I won't use the term ignorant, but oblivious to pool safety, pool hazards. Do we have any studies or information that indicates a significant portion of pool owners are oblivious to the dangers?
ADH doesn't have anything as it pertains to Arkansas, Representative Payton. There is, as a point of discussion, we don't know how many private pools are and spas and hot tubs are in Arkansas right now because we don't currently regulate them. So I couldn't point you to any data, but I'd be happy to go back to it with our experts and see if there are any from other states that they may be able to point us to.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gonzalez, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you know if this international swimming pool and spa code applies to residential pools, or is that usually just public areas?
What is referenced in the bill is pertaining to residential, Representative. So and that is our understanding. Again, Arkansas Department of Health does not have regulatory authority over residential currently. So we just do the public pools out, the large public pools is what we handle.
All right, any other questions? Seeing none, is there anyone in the audience to speak against the bill? For the bill? Seeing none, Representative, you ready to close?
Yes, sir. And the only thing I can say is just help me inform the public about the dangers of children that are drowning.
What's the will of the committee? Sorry, Representative, I don't have a motion. Thank you for your presentation. Okay, we're going to move on to next item on the agenda is HB 1439. Representative Pilkington, was there somebody to present that for him? Don't see anyone. All right, we'll move on down to HB 1622. Representative Gray, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just for expediency, if I could, I'd like to have Lloyd Warford with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit actually sit here with me and help present the bill.
If you would, please introduce yourself and who you represent.
My name is Lloyd Warford. I'm the Deputy Attorney General in charge of the Medicaid Fraud Unit for the state of Arkansas.
All right, thank you. Representative, you're recognized.
If you would go ahead, I'll let you present. You can do it much better than I can.
Mr. Chairperson, this bill affects the authority, the investigative authority of the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit as it relates to the maltreatment statute. State and federal law both control what the Medicaid Fraud Unit has to do, and right now those two laws are out of sync. In 2012, Congress passed a law that the Medicaid Fraud Control Units were supposed to investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in boarding care facilities and created a definition for boarding care facilities. In 2020, they passed a law that expanded it further, that we're supposed to investigate and prosecute cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation of any Medicaid recipient who is abused, neglected, or exploited in a Medicaid setting. We've been doing that strictly under the Attorney General's general law enforcement power and the authority of the office to bring civil cases and to litigate. But our maltreatment statute has not been modified to adopt that new definition. What this bill does is adopt the federal definition of boarding care facilities and expand the authority of the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit to investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in those settings.
All right. Representative, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, we don't have anyone signed up to speak for or against the bill. Anyone in the audience to speak against this bill? For the bill? Sorry, was there any questions from committee? You're recognized, Representative Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you not already have the authority to investigate anybody that's accepting Medicaid funds?
It's complicated. I wish I could make this simple. It's not. we have criminal authority. We can investigate an incident in the same way that law enforcement does. There are certain procedures and policies that apply to law enforcement when they're investigating cases. There are administrative authorities under the maltreatment statute that allow us to investigate cases very differently. For example, if we were to go to a facility where there was, where they did not receive Medicaid funds and the maltreatment statute didn't apply for them, and we asked to see the residents and they refused access, we get into that facility. And we can do that. And we have, if we go there under the maltreatment statute, it's a facility that's covered by the maltreatment statute, they can't refuse entry to us under the law. So it affects how we go about investigating the cases. The vast majority of facilities in the state of Arkansas already receive Medicaid funds, so it's not going to be a change, but to a handful of facilities where they do not receive Medicaid funds. And in those cases, it will affect how we can approach that facility, even though it doesn't, we're not entirely prohibited from investigating it now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if the facility accepts the funds, then you have the ability to go in now. But if they don't, but they have a resident who is Medicaid, this is what that's allowing you to do, is if they have a resident in a facility that doesn't accept Medicaid funds.
It applies the rules and procedures and the authority that's set out in the Medicaid, in the maltreatment statute.
To a facility that does not accept Medicaid funds.
Yes, and let me explain this as well. They are currently covered by that, and they can currently be investigated. It's just investigated by DHS rather than us. So let me finish with this last thought, and maybe this will help. There are no new crimes committed by this. There's no new type of maltreatment created by this. There are no acts or conduct criminalized by this statute. It simply affects the Medicaid fraud unit's ability to investigate those instances. And frankly, in some cases, we bring a little more to the table than other people can. I have nurses on my staff. I have lawyers who are nurses on my staff. I have licensed professional counselors who are also certified law enforcement officers. I have accountants. I have a financial analyst. I have a CPA. All of which can be used to investigate exploitation cases and abuse cases and those people are not there for DHS or for local law enforcement. So that's what we bring to the table when we come.
Representative Wardlaw, you're recognized for a question. Representative Boyd, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarity's sake, so this would allow you to investigate and bring the Attorney General staff on board to investigate. But if it, say, happened in Craighead County, then the prosecutor of Craighead County would still have to be involved in the process to prosecute, or does it somehow allow the Attorney General's office to be
Absolutely.
the one to prosecute?
The local prosecutor has complete control over anybody being prosecuted.
Representative Dodson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I'm understanding you correctly, this is opening up to where you can investigate independently of DHS being involved in having to investigate.
We have overlapping jurisdiction now with DHS for all Medicaid funded facilities, and we work with them closely in those investigations. What this does is it expands our ability to investigate to facilities that don't have Medicaid funding, that do not have Medicaid funding. Yeah, but we already work with DHS. DHS will still be involved.
So that's all under the Attorney General's office. Not, sorry, I was thinking you were the Medicaid fraud. Is the Medicaid fraud division?
Yes, each state has to have a Medicaid fraud unit that has law enforcement authority, investigative authority throughout the state. In all but 7 states, those units are in the Attorney General's office, and that's where it is in Arkansas.
But this is expanding it beyond Medicaid.
Yes.
I think I'm more confused
Well, I don't think Congress passes the laws. We're 75% funded by the federal government. The federal government, initially from 1976 until 2012, we were restricted to only be able to investigate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in Medicaid-funded facilities. In 2012, the federal law changed. And to the extent we have authority, we have been investigating those cases, but we have a limited ability to do so. This would put all of the nursing facilities on the same footing without regard to where they get their funding.
So now the Medicaid fraud unit will be investigating non-Medicaid related institutions.
We have always investigated non-Medicaid abuse, neglect, and exploitation cases. You do not have to be a Medicaid recipient to be a victim in one of our cases. So we have prosecuted cases, investigated and prosecuted cases involving non-Medicaid recipients in Medicaid funded facilities who are abused, neglected, or exploited in non-Medicaid funded facilities since 1976. So our victims do not have to be Medicaid recipients, and never have been. But the facilities, our authority to go into the facility was limited to Medicaid facilities. It's complicated, but essentially Arkansas has had two standards of protection. One standard of protection for Medicaid funded facilities and a lesser for non-Medicaid funded facilities. And this makes them the same. They'll be treated the same.
Any further questions from committee? Seeing none, I'll ask again, is there anyone here to speak against the bill, for the bill? Seeing none, Representative, are you ready to close for your bill?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you guys can all see why I handed it off and allowed it to be explained by someone other than myself. But I think I completely understand what you're saying, Representative Dotson, and the best I can understand it myself is this is something that the federal government has allowed states to do under this division for the past 10 years. And so we're just essentially bringing ourselves up to code, even though non-Medicaid and Medicaid, I do understand the points you're making. Yeah, I'm closed for the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I make a motion to pass.
I have a motion to pass. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gray, you're recognized to present HB 1623.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to do the same thing I did on the last bill and ask Mr. Lloyd Warford to sit at the table with me and present the bill.
Sir, would you introduce yourself again, please?
My name is Lloyd Warford. I'm the Deputy Attorney General in charge of the Medicaid fraud unit.
You're recognized.
This one's a heck of a lot easier to understand. Congress has given private citizens the right to bring a claim in federal court where people have defrauded the Medicaid system. Those claims are always some division of state and federal money. The percentage changes over time, but it's roughly 70% most of the time. Congress has also given those individuals the authority to file a claim on behalf of the state of Arkansas in each of those cases for the 30% that Arkansas has at stake in those claims. Those lawsuits are sealed. The federal government does not share that information with us. We are not involved in those lawsuits. We have no ability to monitor those lawsuits. At some point, we typically are sent a settlement offer, and with very little information, we have to decide whether or not we're willing to take that settlement. Because of the process the federal government uses, we are not permitted to speak to the relator. We often are not allowed to see the pleadings. So we have to make a decision on it. What this bill does is require any person who's going to file a claim under the federal law to give us notice of that. And then at that point, also gives us the opportunity to intervene if we think that's in the best interest of the people of the state of Arkansas. If nothing else, it will give us the information we need to know whether or not we're getting a good deal when the federal government settles on our behalf. Appreciate your support of me.
Any questions from committee? Seeing none, we have no one signed up to speak for or against the bill. Anyone in the audience to speak against the bill, for the bill? Seeing none, Representative, you ready to close for your bill?
I'm close for my bill, Mr. Chair. Make a motion to pass.
Have a motion to pass. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we move down to SB 143. Representative Gray, you're recognized to present that bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one I think I can do myself. So what this has to do with essentially is a DUR board. It has to do with product and label expansions, new medications that are essentially approved by the FDA. What we're asking here is that the Medicaid program automatically allow new drugs, new medications that are approved by the FDA to be considered, I guess, to be considered formulary upon approval. And instead of right now, what they're doing is saying, if you've got a medication that's approved by the FDA, we have to wait until the DUR board meets and decides that the medications are clinically appropriate and they add them into the formula. So that's taking like 9 months to a year sometimes in order to get these fibrosis. I know it's one of the things we talked about last session, breakthrough medications, but when we're having to wait 9 months to a year, it's affecting people's lives. So essentially what we're saying is, let's go ahead and approve these upon FDA approval. And then the DUR board can meet like they normally do at the back end. And then we're also setting, let me find what it's called here. Establishing a rare disease advisory council within the Department of Human Services. Input in writing to the Arkansas Medicaid Drug Utilization Review Board, which is what I'm calling the DUR board, when the board reviews a drug or treatment for a rare disease or condition. And so we're very specific.
Representative, when you talk about rare disease, I don't, or is it already defined somewhere else?
That I do not know. I don't know. We'll keep reading and looking and see if I get the answer for you here in a minute.
All right. Committee, any questions?
No reasonable expectation, drug for the disease or for the drug.
Peyton, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I got confused on the board so you're creating a commission or that reviews the drugs, or is there already one in existence and we're creating another one that does something different?
So there is a DUR board already in existence. Council. So essentially to provide, because the DUR board, they don't have a wide to this council to be able to advise the DUR board on that particular medication and what its purposes are and whether
well, yes, we're going to do the review later. So once you've already had the drug on the street for some time, are they going to be more hesitant in the review to see the problems and say, no, we need to take it away? And then also, because we fast-tracked it to use, then there's not so much urgency to review it as quick. So, my concern, do we create a backlog and do we cause them not to want to take one away if they see a problem with?
Actually, I don't think so. Right now, it's taking them at least 9 months to a year to even bring it. There is no urgency right now, so I don't see that as an issue. And once it being allowed to be used, the physicians are still going to have to follow what's clinically appropriate for the medications. I don't know of that many, or I say I don't know of any new label, expansion label medications that have not been approved for the proper use by the DUR board. They've just been stalling extended period of time to add it into their formulary products.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Dodson, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I applaud the effort to try to get these things fast tracked to get it out there as soon as FDA approves it. I'm not so excited about creating an entirely new board or council or whatever they're called. Have you thought about just having it fast tracked, getting it out there after FDA approval automatically, and then having the existing board go back and just do that review, and allowing them to call on expertise as they need it, if they needed additional expertise?
And I think that would be an option. So that currently, so right now, if we change what would happen, but the expertise would be in the form of this advisory council. My main goal with this is to get the medication into the hands of the patients sooner than what's currently done. Secondary for me is the advisory council. And if that's something that I'm getting I see where this is going. I would be glad if that's the wishes of this committee to pull this down and look at possibly removing the advisory council. Okay. And at least getting the meat of the bill and our intent done.
Is that your suggestion, Representative Dodson?
My whole committee is nodding at me.
So that's your action.
That's what I will do. I would like just real quick, one more thing, if I could. A lot of other states in the U.S., they do allow this. The DUR board, like the medications are automatically approved with FDA approval, and then they go back and review them. So I feel like we are kind of coming into line. So with that said, I will withdraw the bill for today, amend it, and bring it back.
All right. I think the committee agrees with your intent here. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Okay, committee, we're going to go back up the agenda now. We have some other folks that have come in the room. So we're going to go back up and start at the top where we stopped. So Representative Gonzalez, SB 301, you're recognized. Committee, we have an amendment that's going to be coming around.
No, it's
The amendment is not on 301. Okay, there is no amendment on 301. Bill, go ahead and pass that out. We'll get to that bill. Okay. Representative, you're recognized to present SB 301.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you don't mind, I'm going to have Senator Sullivan come up here.
That's fine. Senator, if you would, please introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dan Sullivan.
Thank you. Representative, you're recognized to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee, y'all know how I like to present bills, keep it short and sweet. I think Senator Sullivan had more he wanted to say. Basically, all this bill does is make the health department and any other state agencies that collected fines due to coronavirus violations return those fines to the businesses. Most of these businesses suffered enough through the regulations that were placed on them from our government that we don't need to stack fines on top of that. So we just.
Yeah, I'd just add that we asked Dr. Delahaye in committee if they would enforce some of these rules on big businesses, and she said no, that they would consider it, but they were not, and I never heard back from them. The same thing with some of the other electives that were placed on our businesses on the 11 o'clock curfew. They didn't have any evidence that would work. And I asked for it and got the evidence back that it didn't work. And the reason they gave, among other things, was modeling. And yesterday, and Dr. Romero has said that they don't necessarily use modeling to make decisions, but they do. I went to a meeting, the governor had a meeting in Jonesboro. That invitations were set out to community leaders, and I didn't get an invitation. when I called the governor's office, they said they would consider that. I got an invitation to go, but this is what we're facing. You know, we as representatives and elected representatives of the people, we just want a voice. This has never been about the directives. Representative Gonzalez and I were the first ones to go file the directives that the governor wanted in the bill to make that bridge between the end of the emergency order where we went when it ended. We filed those bills, so we support what we're doing. This is strictly about representative government. I appreciate you hearing the bill. Thank you.
Okay, committee, Representative Boyd, you recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if you will oblige me, I actually have two, or I can ask one to be put back in the queue, however you want to do it. Number one, I just normally consider small businesses. There were no large business fines, and you're confident of that, just making sure I understood that correctly.
Yes, they were mostly your small hairdressers and cosmetology places and our small restaurants. There have been one or two larger stores, but the big box stores, they admitted that they were not going to monitor them. And I think the total fines was somewhere around $40,000 to $50,000 was the totality of it.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you're recognized.
For one more question, just real quick. And, you know, I just have to ask, I consider myself conservative, and I would say I'm a rule of law kind of guy. So someone who would come to me and say, how could you support this? This was the law at the time. How could you undo the law retroactively? Help me with how I would answer that.
Yeah. You go there, you look. Yeah, you know, we have done it frequently. We have found out that the law erred in sending people to prison, and we've let them out of prison. So we have found out that we found out multiple times that a rule that we intended, maybe it had a different effect than we intended with the rule that we made. So we walk back agency rules quite frequently. I think I've got a couple on we're going to be running later that kind of correct error. You hear the agencies come up all the time and say, you know, I'm running this for XYZ agency because we made an error in that. And I think we just erred in doing these businesses. I also think, you know, we make the law, and the executive branch enforces the law. When the executive branch makes the law and enforces the law, at some point, we have an obligation to correct that. If you're going to come into my district, and I hope you all see it this way, if you're going to come into my district and you're going to fine, punish, restrict, enforce rules, then I, as a representative, want to have a voice in that. And I understand the Emergency Act well, and I think there certainly is a place for emergency action by the executive branch. But at some point that ends. And I know many of us contacted the governor's office and contacted the executive branch and asked to be a part of that. And that was denied. So I think, you know, as far as following the rule of law, I wish they had done that and followed the executive branch had followed the law and brought us in.
All right, any further questions? Representative Payton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this just talks about the fines. If somebody was found in violation of a health department directive or ABC board, that's still a violation, just returning the fine, right?
Correct.
So as far as the rule of law, it's satisfied by whatever website they maintain that says this restaurant had so many violations. Those violations are still reflected on it. Yes. Okay. To my knowledge, they are. Yeah. We're just returning the money. And, you know, I think it's precedent also, you know, if you are a rental property owner and person dumps the garbage on your rental property, and the government of the city were to fine the owner of the property, they would be in violation of the law. And they would give their money back and fine the person that dumped the trash. So it's not unusual for government to make an error, and it's not unusual for us to repay the money. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, any other questions, committee? Seeing none, we do have two people signed up to speak against the bill. Dora Chandler Please come forward and introduce yourself and who you represent.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Dora Lee Chandler. I am the Director of Alcoholic Beverage Control. And I'm here today to speak against this bill and explain to you how ABC became involved in this matter. As we all know, COVID-19 hit the state in March of 2020. An emergency declaration was made and directives began to be imposed by the Arkansas Department of Health with the intent to protect the safety of employees and patrons and others with potential exposure. And the focus became on the different commercial businesses. The alcoholic beverage control permit locations became a focus because it's different for those commercial environments and entities because of the on-premise and the private club permits that we provide them. They're in close proximity. The patrons are in close proximity. They have to have removed their masks for eating and drinking, and generally speaking louder to be heard over music and other noise within that facility. From March to July 1, my office would receive complaints of individuals not complying or entities not complying with those directives that were set out in the guidelines of the Department of Health. At that point in time, we forwarded those to the Director of Enforcement, of Alcoholic Beverage Control Enforcement, and they would send agents to educate and investigate those complaints. As the numbers rose, there was a point in time when the Director of Enforcement began to have systematic COVID-19 checks going forward from July 1. Since July 1st and the systematic checks were completed by enforcement, they completed over 5,800 compliance checks and forwarded to the office 257 violations. Forwarded less than 5% of their checks. 95% of your constituents and the governor's constituents never came to my office. Of the 257 reports forwarded, 33 written warnings were issued by my office. There were 224 potential monetary penalties. Of those, 68 fines have been paid, 69 are still pending review, 72 offers have been issued, and 15 were set for hearings. It's been stated that we arbitrarily and unfairly applied the fines that you seek to refund at this point. We reviewed multiple criteria for those reports that we reviewed. There was not one overriding criteria that we looked at. And instructions we had provided or enforcement provided to assist in them following the guidances. Why refund or why not refund at this point? I'm asking y'all to consider not refunding the fines because of the message that it sends. Every action taken centered around the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of Arkansas must be related to the emergency. A vast majority of not just your constituents, but the governor's constituents complied with the guidance and criteria from the Department of Health. As I stated, less review. It was stated on the Senate floor that we were punishing permittees for action of the patrons. But I'm here to testify that the fines issued resulted from behavior within the control of the permittees. Less than 5 permitted locations that were reported to ABC administration for violations were the result of a report that a patron had misbehavior or non-compliance in their behavior. But that behavior was invited by the permittee through either signs indicating they do not require face masks, or checking people's IDs as they entered the club and telling them not to worry about needing a mask, or to opening up the dance floors to dancing. Refunding ignores the rule of law, and it denigrates not only the agents and local law enforcement officers that sent reports to us, but also those that complied, the 95% that sacrificed income in an effort to comply with the criteria. Refunding rewards non-compliant behavior and further punishes those that did comply. These were valid, lawful directives that were undertaken in good faith to protect the health and welfare of the citizens of Arkansas, and in an attempt to keep from a complete and continuous shutdown of the state. Any establishment that disagreed with the offer of settlement that we sent out had a redress. There was no unfair burden placed upon them. They could request a director's hearing. There was no attorney necessary to contest the offer and ask for a hearing. We did them doing them by go-to, so they don't have to travel to Little Rock as we did prior to COVID. So they don't have to appear in person. 15 permittees have been set for hearing. Less than 10% requested hearing. And on more than one occasion, the offer has been reduced to either a warning or the charges have been dismissed. The violation has been dismissed based upon the testimony of that permittee. Everyone has an opinion about the efficacy of the guidance and criteria, just as people do about whether they should be prohibited from smoking in public or being required to wear a seatbelt. And I understand that the guidances came from the executive branch, not the legislative branch, like my examples, but they did come from an authoritative figure that was allowed at the time. And this is about the larger picture. If you all elect to immunize the fines, you're setting a precedent that if you don't like the rules, contrary to the hard work put into creating them, then they do not have to be followed. For many years in private practice before turning to state government, I can tell you that most individuals, when they make the decision to violate a rule, they don't set debate.
Excuse me. Representative Wardlaw, do you have a motion?
I do. Can we call a question? Motion to call the question.
Motion to call the question. The motion is non-debatable. So all in favor of calling the question, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries.
Motion do pass.
Motion do pass by Representative Wardlaw. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Motion carries. Congratulations, Representative. Your bill is passed. We're going to move down to HCR 1001. Representative Gonzalez, you're recognized to present your resolution.
HCR 1003. And I
1003, sir.
I do have an amendment on this.
You do have an amendment?
Yes. You already have the amendment passed out.
That amendment's been passed out.
Okay, the amendment's passed out. So, okay, all the amendment does is update it. So this resolution was filed pre-session. The emergency has been renewed twice since then, and other things added. So update it to the current emergency and add a list of co-sponsors. Make a motion to adopt the amendment.
The amendment. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Your amendment's been adopted. You're recognized to present the bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee, this concurrent resolution is what it takes to call for the legislature to call for an end to the emergency. Many of y'all sat through a meeting with me the other day that Dr. Romero spoke at, that he said he would never recommend calling an end to the emergency, and talked about it being a national emergency. When I questioned him specifically about it being a state emergency issues, it was more the threat to the state from surrounding states and other states in the nation. So at that point is when I decided that if we're not going to get that from the executive branch, that we were going to have to do something ourselves. So this is what it takes to do it.
All right, committee, any questions? Representative Ferguson, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, this bill just allows us to determine the emergency. It doesn't end the emergency.
No, emergency will immediately end.
And so what would the financial impact be, and the impact, I guess, would it end all the emergency orders for telemedicine and all those kind of things?
Yes, everything done through the emergency directives would come to an end. As far as funding goes, it won't necessarily stop federal funding. It would have to be changed, but we can handle that stuff through rules. Some of the emergency executive orders that we've already put into law. I just ran another one in judiciary earlier that is a business liability protection that I will make sure goes ahead of this. But other things, as y'all know, I've ran on House Board and we've already passed and they're in law. I realize telemedicine has been delayed a little bit.
A lot of emergency orders out there that are being impacted.
Representative Boyd, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Gonzalez, I just want to be very clear about what it does and doesn't do if we end the emergency, as best you understand. So if we end the emergency, we being the legislature, does it end the mask mandate?
Yes.
Representative Gonzalez, some of the executive orders identified in here have ended, haven't they?
Some of them have changed to guidelines from mandates.
So the emergency has ended, it's just a guideline now? On some of them, I'm not talking about all of them.
No, the mandates and the guidelines aren't necessarily, I mean, they're a part of the emergency declaration. We're still under a declared emergency.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Representative Wardlaw, you're recognized.
Representative Gonzalez, I hate a mask more than anybody, and I think I drink more water and Coke, so I don't have to wear one now than I ever have. So I'm compliant. But the facts are the facts, and we're getting vaccines out slowly but surely. I think I heard on the news last night, we're close to 1 million vaccines out. It's in the 800,000 range, which is about a third of Arkansas. Could you agree to that?
I have not heard those recent.
But those numbers are out there, and I guess we get the health department up there to testify those numbers. But as we vaccinate more and more of the population, I think I'm in a whole lot more favor of ending the emergency and moving on to normal life. But until that point reaches, I mean, are you open at least to a time frame here? If the health department could testify we have 66% of the people vaccinated by this date, would that work? Or are you just dead cut off right now?
I don't know that we have an option as a legislature to set a time in the future to do that. I mean, we have the option of running a resolution to end it or not. I mean, honestly, it could be, the governor could renew the emergency immediately or at any time in the future. So this is the authority that we have at this point. There is another bill out there that would give us a little bit of control in saying that.
Well, and I think Representative Gasway and Senator Hammer have the bill that puts it after the emergency is filed. You have so many days it goes to legislative council outside of session, so the emergency can be ended. I mean, to me, that where we are and where we're headed, and we're seeing numbers getting better, but we're not perfect yet. We still have a lot of people in hospital. We still have a lot of people on ventilators. We're still seeing risk. I mean, I guess I'm asking you, are you open to pushing that bill through so we can look at it at a time frame, or looking to amend your bill to get to that time frame?
No, I fully support that piece of legislation. I think that's great. And, if that particular bill inserts the legislature into the process into the future, which I think we need as well, absolutely, I support that.
Representative Bentley, you're recognized.
Representative Gonzalez, if we pass this resolution, does it prevent anybody from wearing a mask? If somebody can freely wear a mask if they choose to wear a mask, correct? We're not preventing people from wearing masks if they choose to, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Representative Wayne, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Gonzalez, I just have a couple of questions. One is, does it address in this concurrent resolution, if we declare the emergency is over, could the governor just turn right around and declare another emergency?
Yes.
Okay. And then the second thing, the timing of this, I was a little bit concerned just because of things like telemedicine. We've got a couple of things that we still want to address while we're still here in the legislative session. Is there a way for us to kind of perhaps deal with this once we get all of our I's and T's dotted on our wish list of things?
Well, like I said, I filed this pre-session. Before we ever came in here and started, I had this filed, but I realized that there were some other things in the works, some other things that needed to be done. So now we're more than halfway through session, and I'm just now running this. My argument from the very beginning of this emergency declaration was I wanted the legislature involved. I wanted us to have a voice in it. We've been here long enough that If those things were the important things to us, we could have gotten them done. And for one reason or another, they're being held up. At this point, I think it's time to decide if we want to take action on ending this or not. Listen.
All right, any additional questions from committee? Representative Payton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you said you filed this before the session. We're 60 days into the session. You've been waiting patiently. Are you beginning to wonder if some forces are trying to run out the clock and maybe use this to speed the clock up, or I'm just curious if you think it's important that this advance 1 or 2 stages just to try to make sure we keep everybody honest on their intent with the other bills?
Yeah, I do think it's important that we have something out there that's moving forward that at least, shows our people that we're standing up for the legislature and leading the separation of powers.
Thank you. And if I could have a follow-up?
Yes, you're recognized.
So there are 3,400 cases currently in Arkansas, and the population's over 3 million. That's less than 1% or about 1%. 0.1%. Yeah, 0.1%. So do you think that's an emergency?
I do not believe it is at this point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, any other questions? All right, seeing none, we do have 2 people signed up to speak. One informational or against, I'm not sure, but if y'all would come to the table, Mark White, Laura Shue. Yeah, both of y'all come up and introduce yourselves and who you represent. Whoever wants to can go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark White, Department of Human Services.
I'm Mara Shue. I'm General Counsel with the Department of Health.
You're recognized.
Mark.
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm informational on this resolution. Just want to make sure that everybody understands the context and some of the possible consequences from the resolution. Back when the pandemic started, we took a number of steps to try and make adjustments and accommodations because of the pandemic. And these are things that it required us to suspend our rules because there are things that otherwise the rules would have kept us from doing. And that's one of the things that having the emergency in the executive order by the governor, that's what it allows. It allows agencies to suspend their rules to address that emergency. And just to give you just a couple of examples of things we're doing. So for example, around telemedicine, we've greatly expanded the use of telemedicine in Medicaid. So for example, developmentally disabled clients can now receive occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy through telemedicine. Whereas ordinarily under rules they could not, but because we've suspended those rules, they can now. All other forms of behavioral health, also paying for COVID testing, as well as paying for COVID. And so those are some things that we've been able to accomplish thanks to that authority which we've had under the emergency executive order.
Is this a bureaucrat?
Now, going
speaking
forward, we are in a
against
process
the
right
bill
now to do 2 things. One, to take some of those things that still need to be in place temporarily and put them in place through an emergency rule, which will come to the ALC Executive Subcommittee for approval. And there's some other things that we've done, we see that it works and makes sense, and we'll make those permanent. And so those also, we're an emergency rule to get that going, and then a permanent rule long-term to put those things in place. But that is a process we're still in the middle of that process. And so I just want you to be aware that if this resolution passes and the emergency ends before those rules are in place, a lot of those flexibilities are going to disappear. There is going to be a gap there where those things are not available. And so I just want to make sure that the community is aware of that in that context, that I'm happy to answer your questions or refer to Ms. Shue for her presentation.
Ms. Shue, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Despite making significant strides in controlling the virus, there still is uncertainty. As you know, we are under a public health emergency that's been authorized by Title 12 and Title 20 under 20-7-109 and 110 in our rules pertaining to reportable disease that went through.
Committee, would you hold it down a little bit? We can't hear the presenter. proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you all know, we are still under the public health emergency that was authorized by the law under Title 20 and Title 12 in our rules pertaining to reportable disease that was approved by the Public Health Committee and the ALC rules and ALC back in 2018 and that are in Arkansas already and in nearby states that will likely significantly increase the rate of new cases. To the recently, he was referring to the fact that he does consider other states' information and the national emergency information when he is giving advice to the governor in accordance with his role as the secretary, as any cabinet member gives advice to the governor. The resolution ends the protection of the executive orders, and there are several bills pending that affect the emergency that have not passed yet that implement the suspension of the rules, in addition to the ones mentioned by Mr. White, for DHS, EMS providers and hospitals have been given flexibility to respond to the immediate needs by using personnel to the maximum extent of licensure and in their facilities to reallocate resources. These are important things that we need to have flexibility at this time during the public health emergency. Currently, the public health emergency will expire as of March 31st unless it is renewed. The face covering directive or the mask mandate will end on March 31st, but that's based on scientific data and criteria that should be evaluated at that time. If this resolution passes, it takes away the flexibility to react quickly, as the Department of Health is constantly evaluating the information that we receive daily. We have lower case rates that have permitted easing of restrictions, but we recommend that we proceed with caution. Thank you for your time today.
Representative Gonzalez, you recognize. Representative Dotson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark, I had a question, I guess, with regards to the rules, the emergency rules that you talked about, and the promulgation of permanent rules, the flexibility you're talking about, particularly with regards to the telehealth and telemedicine and things like that. This public emergency, I believe, was declared 1 year ago today. Are we at a year?
I believe about a
I think
year.
we're at a year. How long does it take you to get an emergency rule together?
We've been working for the last couple, at least 2 months, probably 3 months, to identify what needs to be kept, what can expire when public health emergency ends, and what may need to be in place for some temporary period that would eventually expire. And so our divisions have been working to identify those, putting those rules together. And so they've been at work on that for the last, again, I would say for the last 3 months.
So you have some pretty good idea of what you're going to be asking for? Have you begun the emergency?
Yes, sir.
Rulemaking process and the permanent?
Yes, sir. And I would expect that what we bring to you is within a matter of, if not days, then just a few weeks. I think we're close.
I think you could do it within a couple of days, if you really try.
We're pushing to get that done as quickly as we can.
Okay. And I'll reserve any other questions. Good, thank you.
Representative Boyd, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These are for Ms. Hugh. I just have a couple questions. First of all, I want to ask you the same question I asked Representative Gonzalez. If the legislature were to end the emergency, would it end the mask mandate? Because I have other information that says the legislature ending the mask mandate is convoluted because it's intermixed between an executive order and Department of Health orders, and I just want to be clear, does it end the mask mandate?
That would depend on the wording of the resolution, but from the way we're reading it, it would end the public health emergency, and so that would end the directives that are currently in effect. But there is the mask mandate issued by the executive branch that would expire on March 31st based on the scientific data.
So I'm sorry, I'm not clear on that answer. If we let's pretend today is the final step of this resolution and it's gone through both chambers. If that ends, does that end the mask mandate after this goes through both chambers, or does the health department still have control of that mask mandate?
we would listen to the legislature and address it at that time, and would likely remove the mask mandate according to the will of the legislature.
So it wouldn't necessarily remove it. We would still have to depend on the Department of Health to remove their order, even if we ended the emergency.
Correct. It's still currently in effect until March 31st, according to the executive branch, the executive order and the Department of Health directive.
Okay. And then I have another question.
Yes.
Chair. Thank you for that answer. I understand it better now. So February of 2020, I believe, Secretary Smith spoke to Public Health, and he spoke about, at that moment in time, we're going to flatten the curve. And we've been going on in over a year now from that meeting. The curve seems to be dramatically going down. I just want to make sure what, in the view of the Department of Health, is still the emergency. Why? I mean, I understand the rules. I get that, and I understand, but I want to understand, because it could go on forever. I mean, what does the end look like? How flat do we have to make the curve?
I think the problem with the public health emergency has been trying to predict the future. We can't predict the future. People often ask for Dr. Smith or Dr. Romero to look in their crystal ball. Things change on a daily basis. When we were issuing the directives back in March and April and May of 2020, we were changing things on a daily basis. It was looking at the data every hour, every second. And so we use our expertise at the Department of Health to help make those decisions. So it's a quick decision. It's something that we have to evaluate on a daily, if not hourly basis.
Representative Ferguson, you recognize for a question.
Thank you. I'm not near as concerned about the mask as the unintended consequences. I just want to be clear what they are. You're saying Medicaid will no longer pay for COVID testing? Did I hear you say that?
That's my understanding, that our ability to pay for the COVID testing right now, we have rule suspensions in place to do that. In order to continue paying for COVID testing, we would have to go back and amend our existing rules, which, as I said, we're in the process of doing that. We will have an emergency rule package to you all to accomplish that, but it's not there yet.
And does that include treatment for COVID?
It would include some treatment, and what specifically I'm referring to is the use of monoclonal antibodies, because that's not something that was envisioned in the remaining rules, and so we had to make special accommodation for that.
What about the, may I ask another question, what about the fiscal impact of pulling down federal dollars? Aren't some federal dollars dependent on us also having declared an emergency? Tell me about those.
Sure, we're receiving additional federal match on Medicaid right now. That's tied to the federal emergency declaration. So the state emergency declaration should not have any bearing on the continuation of that funding.
What about any of the other federal funding? Are there any other federal dollars dependent on us being declared an emergency?
I can get you that information. I will have to follow up with my chief financial officer as far as all the COVID CARES money. It's my understanding that there are some tax implications for businesses, but businesses would have to speak to that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Dodson, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This was for you, Laura. I was in a meeting a week or so ago with Dr. Romero, and he had mentioned something about the criteria that they were looking at for March 31st to, I guess, advise on with regards to the masks mandate, and had mentioned what that criteria was. And at that time, he said that we were currently below that, to where we're heading that direction. And when asked, he had said that we were there for about 3 weeks at that time. That was a week ago. Have we risen above that since then, or are we still there? Or are we now 4 weeks into that, having met that criteria where March 31st is going to be?
The criteria of which you speak is the 7-day average of testing positivity remaining below 10%. If the average is 7,500 that are tested daily, And then also if the testing is below 7,500 average specimens daily, then the number of hospitalized patients would be the indicator. So that in that case, that it would be fewer than 750 hospitalized patients that would be the trigger. It's my understanding that we're currently under that rate. But again, we would ask that we would proceed with caution and be looking at that data on March 31st.
So it hasn't risen above that. I mean, it hasn't fallen below that, I guess, technically, in the last week since he gave that update. So we are now 4 weeks into having met that criteria.
I would hate to speak to the data as I don't have that with me currently at hand. It does change on a daily basis, and I would hate to say something on the record that would be incorrect, but I'm happy to follow up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other question, but I have one, and I'm a little confused here on the executive orders. I guess on February 27th, the governor made a statement that he ended all the orders except the mask. So is that the governor's executive orders, and is there a difference in the governor's executive orders and the Department of Health executive orders?
My understanding is he did change some of the directives to guidance, but the declaration of emergency is still in place. And as I understand, that's what this resolution undoes, is it undoes that declaration of emergency. And that's what allows us the authority to suspend rules.
So the declaration of an emergency, the mask requirement mandate is still in effect. What other things are still in effect?
For us, it would be those rule suspensions that we put in place around Medicaid, around some of our other areas, to allow for these additional services and flexibilities that are needed for due to the pandemic. But there are no directives in place. If I can distinguish between telling someone to do something in a directive as opposed to we're allowing some things that weren't allowed before.
So our restaurants are allowed to be open 100%?
And I cannot speak to that. That would be within the purview of Department of Health.
Mr. Chair, if I could address that, all of the directives that were in effect back in February, I believe there were 17 that were still in effect, they moved to guidances, and so they now are strong recommendations. They're based on scientific data and medical consensus, and so we strongly recommend that the folks follow our guidelines, that they are mere guidelines and not directives.
So are guidances and recommendations enforceable?
No, sir.
Thank you. Representative Ferguson, you recognize.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get this clear in my head. We can still have a declared emergency, but get rid of the mask mandate and other things and still have a declared emergency. Am I right? Those things could be lifted and still have a declared emergency. So we keep things like the medical payments for COVID and testing in place. Is that right?
Correct. And some states have done that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you for your comments. Okay, Representative, are you ready to close for your resolution? Representative is closed. You have a motion. Okay, we have a motion of due pass as amended. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none. Representative Wardlaw, you're recognized. Don't be shy. Any further discussion? Representative Wing, you're recognized.
I'm just, some of the concerns I had, I mean, I'm all in favor of what we're trying to do here. I'm just worried about the timing of it. I don't want to leave some unfinished business that's important to what we need to do. And I know that we've got a bill that we sent out of here that is over in the Senate that got changed up a bit. And that's something that's, I think, important to most of us. Just kind of helped me feel a little bit more comfortable with that. And also with the fact that we could do this and then the governor could turn right around tomorrow and then undo all of this by declaring a new emergency. Just kind of help me through that.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was recognized for discussion on the motion or not. To your concerns about the timing of it, I think, you heard him say that the funding is, if the funding is the issue, I guess I need to know more about what your concern is on the timing. If it's a funding, that's not, from my understanding, that is not tied to us being under a declared state emergency. It does have to do with some of these rule changes, and being able to suspend the rules. But I would also say that they can bring the emergency rules to us for our approval. But as long as we remain under a declared emergency, the executive branch has all the authority. So if we remove the emergency, then it puts us back into control of it. I don't see that we lose any type of funding.
I guess that wasn't funding as much, but things like telemedicine. That we haven't put that check mark yet on the things that we need to take care of as a legislature. And I didn't want to get this in front of that and then have us have some regrets later.
If we pass this out of here today, you have my word, I'll hold it up until we at least hear the telemedicine bill and decide whether we want to pass it or not. That way, the legislature will have a say and we can move on from there.
Representative Miller, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To me, this comes down to the simple thing. For a year now, this stuff's been going on. The first couple of weeks were pretty crazy. I know all of y'all were getting calls like I was, schools, and trying to figure out what we were going to do and whatever. I literally have not heard from one single constituent of mine saying, hey, please make sure we stay in a state of emergency and we have all these regulations and mandates and directives. Please, I beg you, Josh, call the governor, ask him to mandate some more stuff. I've not heard from one single person in my district saying that. I have heard from many saying the exact opposite, and who were very frustrated, as I was, when I turn around and say, I'm as worthless as things on a board hog. Because, I mean, we're in a state of emergency. We're not even consulted. We've gone through a year of not even being consulted. Now, I understand that we can pass this out here tomorrow and there can be a new one issued. But by God, I think it's time that we stick up and say, hey, next time, consult us. So for that, I'd ask for a good vote on this.
All right, any other discussion? Representative Payton, you recognize.
Just real quickly, I want to remind everybody, it's been a year with special session. It just seems that it's being drug on forever. So, thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions. The motion is do pass as amended. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay.
No.
Ayes have it, motion passed. Roll call.
That's it, pass, before you said roll call?
I said motion passed. I said motion passed and then three hands and
Representative Cloud.
Yes.
Yes. Representative Davis. Representative Davis. Representative Perry.
No.
No. Representative Penzo.
Yes.
Yes. Representative Wayne.
Yes.
Yes. Representative Pilkington. Representative Pilkington. Representative Coleman.
No.
No. Representative Allen. Representative Allen. Representative Boyd.
No.
Yes?
No.
No. Representative Gonzalez.
Yes.
Representative Gray. Representative Dodson.
Yes.
Representative Eubanks.
No.
No. Representative Wardlaw.
No.
No. Vice Chair Ferguson. No.
Representative, your resolution has failed. All right, committee, we're going to move on down. We got two more bills that we really need to hear today. Senate Bill 378. Is Representative Gasaway still here? So it looks like you may have. He's here, okay. Representative Gasaway, you're recognized to present SB 378.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I would ask, and pointed out an issue to me earlier today about this bill and how it may function given whether we adjourn or whether and stay in session, or whether or not we actually adjourn and end the session because of the redistricting issue that's kind of looming out there. There's some question about whether we'll adjourn or whether we won't, and whether we do or not under this bill would affect whether or not issues related to the funding are considered by joint, or whether they're considered by council. And so I think what I'd like to do is hold off on that one until we have a more clear picture of what's going to happen with regard to adjournment. And so if with the chair's permission, I'd like to set this one aside for the moment and then but only proceed with SB 379.
Are you saying whether we adjourn or recess? Is that what would be?
That's the proper terminology. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yes.
we can do that. So we'll move on to SB 379.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colleagues, this bill is in response to what we've seen over the last year with regard to the emergency powers that have been exercised by the governor and the extent of involvement that our current Emergency Services Act affords the legislature. As many of you know, after the emergency declaration was issued, we in the legislature were consulted very little. We did not have any real meaningful decision-making during the emergency from the time that it was declared by the governor. Many of you, I'm sure like me, received calls from your constituents when certain, whether it was by executive order or directive of the Department of Health came down, who wanted to know, why is this happening? Why can I not operate my business? Why can I not cut hair? Why can I not restaurant? What are you guys doing down there? You had to respond to your constituents that I didn't have anything to do with that, no say in that issue. Here's the governor's office number, call them. And that was the position I found myself in, and I'm sure that many of you found yourself in. And that goes back to the Emergency Services Act of 1973, which sets forth the powers of the governor and the powers of the legislature in the event of a disaster. And what we find is unfortunately, the Emergency Services Act of 1973 gives the governor almost ultimate power during these states of disaster. Legislative research, when I started working on this issue back in the summer of 2020, what the legislative history was on the Emergency Services Act, what may have occurred during the debate, and why the legislature would have chosen to give away so much power to the governor and not keep any for themselves. And the Bureau wasn't able to find anything. I asked them if they could even go back and look in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette to see if there was any reporting on the issue and any debate about why the legislature would choose to give up that much power and authority. And they couldn't find anything, and that's still a mystery to me today. So the situation that we found ourselves in was not unlike what every other legislature in the country found themselves in that we had an old statute
that really hadn't been tested or dusted off since its initial passage. And again, this was originally passed in 1973, and we've not had a reason to dust it off or use it and know that how limited we truly were with regard to the power of the legislature until this current pandemic. And so what we've seen is that the legislature has no power in these emergency situations. And what we seek to do with this bill is to empower the legislature when there is an emergency declaration by the governor, giving the legislature the power to terminate, giving the legislature power over executive orders, giving the legislature power over determinations and directives issued by the Department of Health. And then there's temporary language at the end in a couple of sections that deal with the present emergency that we're in and how we deal with executive orders and directives that are in place at the time of the passage of this bill. And so that's kind of a separate issue in the first section of the bill, and I'm going to go through it in a little more detail. I don't want to belabor the point. I know it's been a long day. The committee's had a lot of tough issues today, and it's getting late in the day, so I don't want to belabor things, but I do want to cover it thoroughly enough where you feel like you understand what it does. And so what I would say is in the early parts of the bill, we set forth a general framework for how these types of situations will work out in the future with regard to the involvement of the legislature. And then at the end of the bill, we have temporary language which addresses how we're going to deal with the present situation. And so one of the first things that you'll see in the bill, in the first section of the bill, if you're on page 2 of the bill, you'll see that the statewide state of disaster emergency cannot continue for longer than 60 days unless renewed by the governor, so long as legislative council does not deny the request for the renewal. So it can't last any longer than 60 days. If the governor wants to go beyond 60 days, he'll have to request renewal from legislative council, and legislative council will decide at that time whether to terminate or not. But we're not going to let this thing continue for long periods of time before, again, the legislature gets involved. What you'll also see, and what's important in this section, is that beginning on lines 29 on page 2, the legislature will have the authority to terminate a state of disaster emergency at any time. And so there are a couple of distinctions in this bill about states of disaster emergency that I want to be clear about. There's any state of disaster emergency, whether it's what we would call a statewide state of disaster emergency, which is defined in the bill as being 19 counties or 25% of the overall population of the state of Arkansas. That is a statewide state of disaster emergency. Then you just have any state of disaster emergency that the governor may declare. And the point is, if you have a governor who does something that's rogue and violates any standard of common sense, the legislature has the ability at any time to come in and terminate that emergency, whether that's a local emergency because of something that happened in Jonesboro, or whether that's a statewide state of disaster emergency. How do we terminate, under this bill, a governor's state of disaster emergency? And how we get there is, it can be called by the Speaker of the House and the Pro Tem of the Senate, or if 51 members of the House request a meeting, and 18 members of the Senate request a meeting, then we can get to a meeting to terminate a state of disaster emergency, whether that's a local state of disaster emergency or a statewide state of disaster emergency. And we can do that at any time. And we do that by committee of the whole. The House would meet at a committee of the whole to debate the declaration of state of disaster emergency. The Senate would meet as a committee of the whole to debate the state of disaster emergency. And if we passed a concurrent resolution, then that would go to the governor for his signature. There were different variations of the bill, I will tell you, that had different types of resolutions that could be passed to terminate the state of disaster emergency. We ultimately went with concurrent resolution because there was some question about if you didn't do it by concurrent resolution, which is the type of resolution that's recognized in the Constitution. So generally, I mean, the legislature can pass bills, which become laws by the signature of the governor, or we can pass concurrent resolutions, which carry much more force than other types of resolutions. And so with the concurrent resolution, if we pass that, the House and Senate, then it goes to the governor for his signature. And we write into the bill that it would operate like the passage of any other bill. If it goes to the governor and the governor won't sign it, then in 5 days, we come back and vote again, and that concurrent resolution terminates the emergency. If the governor vetoes the concurrent resolution, so to speak, then same process. After 5 days, we come back, we can override that veto, and we can terminate the emergency. And I want you to keep in mind, that can happen at any time, okay? And that's any emergency, local or statewide. And so that's the first section of the bill. The next section of the bill sets forth the process when the governor declares a statewide state of disaster emergency. And so again, we define statewide state of disaster emergency, and we define that as affecting 19 counties or more, or 25% of the overall population of the state of Arkansas, according to the most recent census. If there's a state of disaster emergency that affects that number of people, then the governor has to declare it as a statewide state of disaster emergency. Upon the governor declaring a statewide state of disaster emergency, and this is important because this guarantees legislative involvement. If there is a statewide state of disaster emergency, the bill says that the legislature shall meet within 8 days to consider termination of the governor's declaration. And that process works the same way that we talked about. That's a committee of the whole of the House to debate a resolution for termination. The Senate meets as a committee of the whole to debate a resolution for termination. If that passes, then it goes to the governor. If the governor won't sign it, it's the same processes that we discussed before. At 5 days pass, we can override that and we can terminate the emergency. And that is a guaranteed meeting, and that was one of the things that we heard from the legislature. We're going to make sure that if it's a statewide, that the legislature is going to get a guaranteed meeting and a guaranteed voice at the outset. One of the other things was we wanted to make it the whole House and the whole Senate, because if the governor issues a statewide state of disaster emergency, it affects everybody. And it's at least at one point in this process, everybody's senator and representative ought to get a vote on whether or not it should be terminated. And so that's why we set that out from the outset, and we do it at 8 days. Thereafter, if the governor wants to renew the state of disaster emergency, that goes to legislative council. And the governor has to submit a letter to council stating that he desires at least 10 days prior to when the expiration date of the statewide state of disaster emergency. He has to submit a letter to council stating that he wishes to renew the emergency. He has to state in that letter the rationale for why he wants to renew that emergency. And then legislative council will meet to determine whether or not to terminate the emergency or not. It'll have to be the entire legislative council. Legislative council can't designate or can't delegate that to a subgroup of legislative council, but it's going to be the whole legislative council that votes on those renewals. And again, a renewal can't last longer than 60 days. And if we're in a state of emergency, there's a provision that the legislative council can adopt whatever rules may be necessary in order to perform its duties under this section. Section 3 says, just kind of interesting, came up in the debate, the governor shouldn't be able to prohibit members of the General Assembly from accessing the seat of government. If you have a state of disaster emergency and you had a governor at the time who wanted to kind of act as a tyrant and say there's no ingress or egress inside the Pulaski County, and the legislature couldn't get here to perform its duties. And I realize that's kind of you have to kind of think like a maniacal governor there. That's kind of an odd way to think. Someone brought it up, and so we made sure to say that the governor can't prohibit us from accessing the Capitol so that we can do our job. Section 4, we talk about executive orders. If the governor issues executive orders, those will go to council for review. If he wishes to then renew an executive order, again, those will be renewed by council individually. Council can terminate the executive orders that the governor may issue. And let's see here. If the governor does issue those, they're effective immediately until it's terminated by a majority vote of the legislative council. And so that's how we deal with executive orders. The same thing has to be a majority vote of the floor. You can't delegate that to some subcommittee council. Section 5 deals with the Board of Health. And what we say there is the Board of Health currently under the Emergency Services Act has tremendous. When you look at what kind of power the Board of Health has, the Board of Health every man, woman, and child in the state of Arkansas to take some legislative oversight over that kind of just extraordinary executive power. That's what you'll see in Section 5. The Board of Health can adopt directives like we've seen in this instance. If they do, one thing that we thought was important to add, they can't combine those directives. In other words, it's like we've seen in pieces of legislation around here where someone puts the poison pill in a directive or in a bill. They have a bill that's full of really great things that no one could ever vote against, and they put that one thing in there that nobody's really for, but they feel like they don't have a choice but to vote for. We specifically prohibit the Board of Health from being able to do that. They cannot combine multiple subjects or directives into a single directive. They have to be individual. Again, those directives under the emergency will become effective immediately because part of what we had to do was try to balance the need, and there were conversations with the governor's office about this, but the flexibility of the governor's office to manage an emergency, the flexibility of the Board of Health to respond to an emergency with appropriate legislative oversight. So if the Board of Health issues a directive, it's good immediately for 30 days. They will go to executive subcommittee, much like rules currently do, and that happens very quickly within the first 4 days for review by executive subcommittee, and then they remain in effect unless the majority of the executive subcommittee terminates them. If that doesn't happen, they have to do like the governor. They have to request a legislative council renewal. They have to do just like the governor. They have to submit a letter stating why they want to renew the directive, and then council will consider termination of those directives. Council chooses to do that. Same way we operate with the governor. You can't delegate that. It has to be a full vote of the quorum of legislative council. And again, that's what you see in Section 5. That's taking control and some authority over the Board of Health. And so I'm going to try to speed this up. We're at the temporary language and we're getting close to the end. Temporary language is how we deal with the current emergency that's in place. If there is, in effect, on the effective date of this act, should we pass it, a state of disaster emergency, then that follows the same procedures that we set out earlier in the bill. So that means the full House and the full Senate within 8 days after passage of this bill are going to vote on termination. Okay? And if the governor seeks to renew, then it'll have to be submitted to council thereafter if we don't terminate it at that initial meeting. Same thing with the Board of Health. If there are directives in place, this actually operates a little differently. If there are directives in place at the time that this bill passes, those directives have to be submitted to this committee, Public Health. And Public Health can meet. So there were lots of directives. Now we know the governor has they've done away with essentially all of those directives. If there are directives in place, then this committee meets with whatever other subject matter committee that in that directive, whether it be education, transportation, there were a number of them to consider. Then they would review them, make recommendations to council, would vote on each of those, whether to terminate those directives. And then if they did not terminate them, then the renewal process every 30 days to council for renewal would work the same way. There is an emergency clause on the bill. If we pass it, it becomes effective immediately. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Representative Gasway, just let me say that I know you've done a lot of work on this, spent many hours on this, and Senator Hammer as well, and done a good job. I know you've met with many departments and individuals, and so appreciate your work on this. Committee, any questions from committee? Yeah, Representative Clyde, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Gasaway, for all the hard work. I can't imagine. Just allow me to kind of pick your brain just a little bit, if you would. You made the statement, quote, that we were consulted very little, meaning we, the legislature, unquote, and that you'd even referenced the Arkansas Democrat Gazette to try to get some information. So just let me read this quote from the Democrat Gazette, since you referenced it, from this week. This is from Dr. Romero. He said, quote, "I wish state representatives and senators had really championed the use of masks and the use of mitigation. There were people that didn't think of this as a major issue," unquote. I really didn't have, as a legislator, the opportunity to champion anything. So my question, with everything you've been through, do you see something in retrospect, 2020 they say, that we could have done as a legislature to help with this situation in spite of this quote?
I think legally, under the Emergency Services Act as it existed, no, I don't think that we had much ability to do anything. The governor could have called us into an executive session. He didn't. That would have been an opportunity for us to weigh in on some of these issues, to hear them out, and to take a vote. The legislature doesn't have the ability to call itself into session. And so without that ability, I think from a purely legal standpoint, we really didn't have a way to weigh in unless the governor would have called us into special session. And of course, that didn't happen.
Representative Boyd, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I got a pretty quick question. So what if this is like a major disaster that like takes out the roads and so on and so forth, and we can't all assemble in Little Rock, not because the governor keeps us out, but because there's that much destruction? How might it work then?
I seem to recall that there's a provision, I know that was discussed. The legislature can adopt rules to deal with those types of situations. Of course, we have our House rules, we have our Senate rules, and we really need to be thinking along those lines if we don't already have those types of emergency provisions available in our existing rules. Of course, you can't bind the future legislature, but we need to look at the rules that we have, and if we ever find ourselves in that circumstance, how we can respond. Whether that's remotely, vote by proxy, vote by or other ways. I think those are things we need to look at.
You recognize for a follow-up.
So just to clarify, so those things we really should be thinking proactively and addressing our House rules once this becomes law.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's a really good question, Representative Boyd, because in some natural disasters, like an earthquake up in our part of the state, there might be instances where nobody can go into an area. That could happen here at the Capitol. And what you're saying, I think, is a remedy for that we should develop a rule in that case.
Yes.
So that's a good question. Any other questions? None. We have no one signed up to speak. Did you have a question, Representative? Is there anyone here to speak against the bill? For the bill? Representative, are you ready to close?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to say, and I think I left this out of my initial remarks, that this is not a criticism of Asa Hutchinson, so to speak, in the way that he's handled this emergency. The governor had to make some very tough decisions. I think what we all feel like as a legislature is we want to ensure that we're consulted. And the current law as it exists does not provide for that. And the people's representatives deserve the opportunity to weigh in on these issues. These issues have affected the entire state, and the people's representatives and their senators, the people's branch of government, deserves to be involved in these issues and from the very outset. And so that's what this bill seeks to do. And with that, I would appreciate a good vote.
Representative Johnson, you recognize. Have a motion of due pass. In committee, I think the discussion's been good here, but we didn't know what a pandemic was None of us are old enough to see one. I don't think anybody's over 100 here, but it's been 100 years since we had one, and we should learn from that process. And I think that's what we're doing here in developing policies that can help us through the next one. So I think it's a good policy. So the motion is do pass. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Congratulations, your bill is passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
All right, committee, thank you. All right, Representative Boyd, you're recognized. Representative Boyd is going to present HB 1136. Is that correct, Representative Boyd?
Yes, thank
You're
you.
recognized.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I've had people here for 2 days.
Go right ahead. You're recognized.
There's an amendment to adopt that just, it addresses a concern